we're going to be in Romans 5. And the first thing we're going to look at in Romans 5 is sin and death. Romans 5:12 through 14 says, "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. For sin indeed was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there is no law. Yet death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam, who was a type of the one who was to come." So the problem is sin. Because when there is sin, then there is separation from God. There is a barrier from God. That's what sin does. It causes a barrier between us and God and ultimately leads to death. Yes, when Adam sinned, it led to physical death, but more importantly, that sin led to eternal separation from God. That's the danger of sin. That's the ultimate punishment of sin, is the eternal death, which is an eternal separation from God, because sin separates us. It causes this barrier between us and God, because God can't be in the presence of sin. And so when we look at that, the connection of sin and death, then we realize what the problem is. In Genesis 3:17, when we first talk about the consequences of sin, Genesis 3:17 through 19 says, "To Adam he said, because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field by the sweat of your brow. You will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you will return." Sin permeates everything. It's pervasive. It gets in and it just settles and it spreads like a cancer. What are some sins? We're in a life group. What are some sins? Murder. Is that what you said? Murder? It's a good one. I say that's a good one. It's a sin. Mm-hmm. Murder, greed. More. Lust. Lying. Sins. Other sins? It's all of them. No. All right. You said lust, greed, coveting, pride, adultery, stealing, sins. All these sins and so many more. They enter in, and normally it is not that we start off with murder. It's not normally that we even get to murder. But sins start becoming a part of our life. And we make it okay. We're like, okay, well, I can do this, and it's okay because it's not a big deal, but before long, then it starts spreading in our life, and it causes this barrier between us and God, and it's not possible for us to live in God's will while we're willfully sinning against God. And that's a problem. So the rest of this passage, we're going to have these contrasts that are going to pop up, and in these contrasts, it's going to show that the differences that are in our life because of God and because of sin. But the first contrast is the superiority of Christ's of Christ's gift over Adam's trespass. In Romans 5:15 through 17, it says, "But the free gift is not like the trespass, for if many died through one man's trespass, much more have the grace of God and the free gift by the grace of that one man, Jesus Christ, abounded for many. And the free gift is not like the rest a result of the one man's sin, for the judgment following one trespass brought condemnation. But the free gift following many trespasses brought justification. For if because of one man's trespass death reigned through that one man, much more will those who receive the abundance of grace and the free gift of righteousness reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ. Now, in this passage, it's talking about the gift that Jesus brings, salvation, righteousness, and then it talks about Adam's trespass, and because of Adam's trespass, it brought sin, which we kind of are talking about this. That sin is a result of separation from God. Now, this is not what Adam wanted. When Adam was tempted, the temptation was not to be separated from God. That's not what was happening. It was absolutely opposite of that. Adam wanted something else. And Genesis 3:4-5, look at the temptation itself. Satan, the serpent, said, "You will certainly not die." He's talking to Eve. "For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be open and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." See, God had told them that if they eat from the tree of knowledge, that was the one thing that they couldn't do, and if they did, that they would die. Now we know that because of that, the result is that they are going to be now facing a physical death, but that's not the death that God was talking about. He said, if you eat of the tree of knowledge, you will die. Meaning that there will be a barrier, there will be a result to that disobedience, to that rebellion against what I said, to breaking my commandment, the one commandment that I gave you. That barrier will be a result of a disconnect from me. And that barrier, that separation from God is death. That does lead to a physical death and then further. That's what he told them. Now when Adam and Eve were tempted by the serpent didn't go say, okay, well, go eat of that tree. It tastes good. Go eat of that tree. You'll get smart. That's not what tempted Adam. That's not what tempted Eve. They didn't want to be at odds with God. They wanted, in a weird way, to be closer to God. They wanted to be like God, and that's how he tempted them. Surely you will not die, but if you eat of it, you will know the difference between good and evil, and you will be like God. That was the temptation. You will be like God. And isn't that how sin works? Sin separates us from God, but in a weird, twisted way, we think that we're going to be able to handle it and still get close to God. We think that we are going to be able to handle whatever comes into our life because of that sin, and in some weird, twisted way, still find a way to be closer to God, when the absolute opposite is true. Is that sin's going to separate us further from God. And that's what Adam dealt with. Though he thought that because if they did this, they'd be like God and they'd be even closer to God, and it wouldn't just be walking in the garden together and talking and everything, that they would become like God and they would be equal on terms with God and spend more time with Him. No, none of that happened. As a result of it, they became further from God. More separated because of the barrier that they caused. That was what trespass led to, and then to all their children and to all of mankind, that trespass still affects us to the day, that barrier that's in our life because of sin. But on the other side of it, Christ's gift leads to the opposite. Ephesians 2:8-9 says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not a result of work, so that no one may boast." So, on one hand, we have Adam's trespass, but on the other hand, because of Christ coming to mankind, we have grace. We have salvation, and that is the gift of Christ. A free gift of Christ that's not based off of our works, not based off of anything that we've done. So we have sin that separates us from God, and then we have salvation that allows us to be in relationship with God once and for all. Now there's a contrast again that furthers this between condemnation and justification. In Romans 5:18 through 19 it says, "Therefore as one trespass led to the condemnation for all men, so one act of righteousness leads to the justification and life for all men. For as by the one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so by the one man's obedience the many will be made righteous." So I think we can wrap our minds around the idea of condemnation. Sin leads to a separation from God, leads ultimately to a physical death, and then beyond that to an eternal death if we don't deal with the problem of sin. But at its core, it's a separation from God. That's the condemnation. But the justification, sometimes, I don't know if we really can wrap our minds around that, because when it says that because of Jesus Christ, we are justified, we are made righteous, that's more than saying, okay, you who were a sinner now can enter into our presence. That's not what made righteous is. It's not a pardon. It's more than that. It's to completely make it so that when God sees us, He doesn't see someone who was a past sinner. He sees someone that has never committed sin. That's what the gift of Jesus Christ is. In 2 Corinthians 5:21, it says, "For our sake He made Him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in Him we might become the righteousness of God." You know, like I like to try to understand things. I like to wrap my mind around things. And so sometimes I look for analogies. I look for examples that can help me to kind of understand things a little bit better. And one of the things that I had read a while back, but I went back and looked at, that kind of helps me understand to be made righteous is a weird example, but it's a car manufacturer, Rolls-Royce, right? And the Rolls-Royce, it's a tongue twister for me, but Rolls-Royce, it is, the way it came about is a very interesting story, but back in 1903, 1904, Royals was this rich guy in England. His dad's a duke. They have all the money in the world. He loves cars. He loves collecting cars. They're kind of brand new, you know, like the idea of cars are brand new, and he loves it. Loved racing horses, loved cars. This is his passion. He's got the money. He wants to develop a new car, but he don't have the real know-how to do so. So that's where Royce comes in. Royce is a poor guy, mechanically inclined, but is building some of the best 10 horsepower engines the world's ever seen, right? He's building these engines, and so Royals and Royce get together, and they actually don't build a 10 horsepower engine. For the first time, they build a 40 horsepower engine. Miraculous. This is a little bit better than your lawnmower. So they build this engine and they build this car, and when they build the car, their slogan, their motto, the way that they brand Rolls-Royce is this is not one of the best cars, this is the best car. That was their motto. This is the best car in the world. Now fast forward a little bit past 1904, you get to the 1920s, and there was a story of that Rolls-Royce is now on their part of their history, but there was an Englishman who had a Rolls-Royce, and he wanted to go on a trip throughout Europe. And in Europe, as he's on this trip, he wants to take his car. So he takes his Rolls-Royce, he goes out, and it has some problems. So he has to contact them. He's in another part of Europe. They fly a mechanic out to where he is. They fix the car. He goes on about his trip. And in the 20s, it's a pretty expensive endeavor that they flew a mechanic out, took care of the car, and did everything. So when he gets back to England, he writes the company a letter, and he's like, "How much do I owe you?" And the company sends back this reply. They said, "Dear sir, there's no record anywhere in our files that anything ever has went wrong with the Rolls-Royce." right? There's nothing. And it's pretty much like that. To be made righteous is God saying, there is nothing in my record that you have ever done anything wrong. There's nothing in my record that shows that you have ever been a sinner, and that's because of Jesus Christ. That's what it means to be made righteous. There is no record of it. There's no memory of it. That is forgotten. It's as if that's not true. That's what God does for us. That's the gift. That's the grace that God pours down upon us. And then going on with the contrast here, we have the reigning power of God's grace over sin. So in Romans 5:20, 21 through 21, it says, now the law came in to increase the trespass, but where sin increased, grace abounded all the more, so that as sin reigned in death, grace also might reign through righteousness, leading to the eternal life through Christ our Lord. So when we look at that and we think, okay, well, this is grace, and then we're dealing with sin and we're contrasting them, we also have to deal with this issue. And this is where a lot of people land. What's the point? I see so many people dealing with this, and they're lost in this. Well, if God's grace abounds, then I can live however I want to. Right? I can live, if grace outweighs sin, and I've given my life to the Lord, I've made a declaration that He is my Lord and Savior and I belong to Him, then grace abounds over any sin that I commit. And you're missing the point. You're missing the point because you need to realize that the sin is the barrier, it's the separation from God. And if you're okay with sinning in your life, you're going to live in such a manner that you're separated from God. You can never be in God's will if you believe that you could continue to live on. And then, the other side of that coin, some people go the other direction. Well, I am a sinner, and I'll never not be a sinner, so what's the point? They don't concentrate on the grace, they concentrate on the sin. Exact same point. If you're living in sin, you will create separation between you and God. And you will never truly be living in a relationship with Him because you won't be able to experience Him in your daily life because the sin is a barrier between you and Him and the experience of God. That's not what grace is for regardless. If you actually look at what grace is, it's when sin increases, grace abounds means this. In Titus 2:11 through 12, it says, for the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people. And read the next part. Training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passion, and to live self-controlled, upright, godly lives in the present age. Grace is not just the gift of salvation to man. It is also teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in the present age. Grace causes us to live in appreciation of what God's done. That's truly living in God's will. So this message this morning, rather short, but it has a point. And it has a serious point. When we think about sin, I think that we sometimes think, Arnie, as you first said, we start naming off a couple of the big ones and we're like, we don't deal with that. Like, it's been a long time since I've had to deal with murder, right? No, we don't deal with murder. We don't deal with a lot of the bigger ones, but some of the smaller ones are the bigger ones we don't break down as God intends us to because we don't deal with it at all. We don't like to think about sin because if we start thinking about sin, then we might have to deal with some of the dark areas in our life, some of the dark corners in our life. House looks clean, but if you were to go over there might be cobwebs in some of the corners. And we don't want to deal with that. Because, no, I'm not a greedy person. Most of the time. You know? I don't covet. Most of the time. I don't lie most of the time. You know? I definitely don't murder anybody. something in my heart maybe sometimes, like on the roadway. Like most of the time, but most of the time doesn't cut it, because when we allow sin to have a foothold in our life, it doesn't matter if it's a dark, dark, small little corner. It grows. And that dark little corner separates us from truly experiencing God in the here and now. And so it's not okay for us to ignore sin. It's not okay for us not to deal with sin. It's not okay not to open ourselves up to examination and allow God to examine our hearts and tell us where the sin is. Because we truly, truly can't experience God's will in our life till we deal with that problem. And it's not overwhelming. The passage is actually encouraging in Romans, because God's grace does abound, but it would be a problem if we don't deal with it. It's a problem if we don't acknowledge it. It's a problem if we don't turn it over to God. And what's funny is that this morning we're sitting here in the middle of a storm, which it looks okay out there right now, but from moment to moment, we don't know what the storm's going to do. And so we're sitting here in a smaller, more intimate setting with I don't know what we would call ourselves, crazy or diehard or whatever we want to call ourselves, but we're here in a more intimate setting this morning, and it's because we love God. It's because we want to worship God. It's because we feel like we have some knowledge of God. We feel like we belong to God. All these things are true and they're beautiful. But I opened up just a few minutes ago. Can we name some sins? And maybe it's because we didn't want our voices heard on camera or whatever, but we named like 8 and then we kind of died off, right? Like, I don't know how we would label ourselves, the mature or whatever, but we named 8. Like, how much are we really looking in our life when we're not even talking about ourselves and we're just naming sins? Sin's something that we're reluctant to deal with. And if we're reluctant to deal with it, we won't deal with it. And if we don't deal with it, we're going to find that there's areas in our life that are keeping us from living in God's will. That's a problem. So the challenge today, before us all, is to open our hearts up and allow God to be the one that examines it. Allow God to be the one to tell us, hey, here is an area. And then giving it over to God, letting Him provide the courage and the discernment to take it away. Because there's no greater place to be than right in the center of God's will. That's where each one of us should desire to be this morning. So that's our challenge this week. If you're at home, that's your challenge. If you're here, that's your challenge. Today we're going to close out with Arnie coming up and leading us in a song.